I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Rabbi Malcolm Cohen from Temple Sinai. Let me say, just mark the absence, I'm sure, of many of our survivors from around the valley, whereby in normal circumstances, without the intervention of technology, they would be able to join us. And certainly it's our intention in the future to be able to bring them together for a face-to-face commemoration. For now, we are really glad that whoever's joining us is joining us online. I want to thank my colleagues on the Board of Rabbis. I want to thank Stefanie and everyone at Jewish Nevada, the Holocaust Survivors Group, Generations of the HaShoah Group, and the Holocaust Resource Center, Esther Finder and Ray Fiel and Heather Klein, who helped plan this. I just want to tell one short story, particularly in relation to Eric and Eli, our speakers today. And we're talking the early 90s. I'm a relatively young, impressionable man, and I'm taking a trip to Israel with a Holocaust education group. And we visit Kibbutz Ein HaChoresh, and we have an idea of who we're meeting, but we're sat down at this very small and simple house. And we invited to sit with a woman called Vitka Kovner, an old woman, very, very kind and sweet to us, who was very hospitable, made us coffee, gave us kirchels, and we started slowly to realize who this sweet old woman was. Vitka Kempner, then Kovner, was the fierce partisan fighter who fought to the last inch in the Vilna ghetto, and then on into the forest, and then planned revenge missions against Nazis with her colleagues after the war finished. And so it seems slightly weird that this sweet old woman was actually, in her time, a vicious and disciplined fighter. And so as I was sitting there, I was thinking about, well, what's the difference between revenge and justice? Are they subtly intertwined? Is it okay, actually, to think about revenge, to fantasize about it, to even in the case of Kovner, to plan for it? Those are the questions in my mind at that time. My conclusion was as follows. It's okay to have a little piece of righteous anger welling up inside of you if you put that to the cause of the Jewish people to vanquish its enemies, particularly where Nazis are concerned. And so that's why I'm particularly interested in a few minutes to speak to Eric and Eli. I certainly think Vitka Kovner would think she was in good company if she was ever in the same room as the two of you. And so thank you everybody for coming here together, partly in righteous anger. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Heather for a song.
So one of the most poignant songs that I've run across in Yiddish song is Unter die Churves von Polen. This piece, Under the Ruins of Poland. I wrote some English so that you can follow along. So I hope you will take this in. It's by a poet named Itzik Monger, very famous, and music by Saul Berezovsky. Unter die Churves von Polen, a Kopf mit blonder Haar, der Kopf und Seite Churden, beide senden Wort. Under the ruins of Poland, a head with golden hair, my girl and also my city lie in rubble there. Doya, meine Doya, 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 meine. Doya, meine Doya, 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 mein. Über die Churves von Polen fällt und fällt der Schnee, Der blonde Kopf und mein Mädel tut mir besuchen weh. Over the ruins of Poland falls silent snow from the sky. The golden curls of my sweetheart told me that this was goodbye. Doria, meine Doria, 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 meine. Doria, meine Doria, 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 mein. Über die Churves von Polen flattert der Vogel a größer schiefe Vogel, zittert mit die Flügel froh. Over the ruins of Poland, lost in the blinding snow, a great white raven of morning, silently winging in flight. Doya, meine Doya, 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 meine. Doya, meine Doya, 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 meine.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us for this very special, albeit different, Yom HaShoah commemoration. I'm Stefanie Tuzman, CEO of Jewish Nevada. We gather, as is our tradition, on this Yom HaShoah day to remember our precious 6 million martyrs, including 1.5 million children murdered by the Nazis. They were our parents, our grandparents, aunts, uncles, sisters, brothers, cousins, and friends. It is vitally important that future generations, mine and others, will always recall and remember them, their lives, and their memories. We will never forget. I am a 3G, a grandchild of survivors, one who survived Auschwitz. And now, more than 75 years after the Holocaust, it is also important on this Yom HaShoah to pay tribute to our precious survivors. Theirs is a special and unique legacy that we honor today, and to them we pledge to not only remember their family members who perished in the Shoah, but that we will also care for them today and remember them in the future. Our survivors' legacy of perseverance and resiliency, of devotion and dedication, of commitment to life and living should be an inspiration to each and every one of us today, especially against the backdrop of this pandemic. Our survivors should serve as an inspiration to us and to the indomitable Jewish and human spirit of life.
It is my honor to introduce our guests who are joining us from the Washington, D.C. area. Eric Lichtblau is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the best-selling author of The Nazis Next Door and Bush's Law, The Remaking of American Justice. His latest book, Return to the Reich, a Holocaust refugee's secret mission to defeat the Nazis, was released in October of 2019. Eric was a Washington reporter for the New York Times for 15 years and for the Los Angeles Times for 15 years before that. He has also written for The New Yorker, Time, The Intercept, and other publications. He has been a frequent guest on NPR, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and other networks, as well as a speaker at many universities and institutions. Eli Rosenbaum is the longest-serving prosecutor and investigator of Nazi criminals and other perpetrators of human rights violations in world history, having worked on these cases at the U.S. Department of Justice for more than 30 years. He served from 1994 to 2010 as director of the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, OSI. The OSI was created by Attorney General order to investigate and prosecute World War II-era Nazi criminals. Eli is also an old friend who introduced me to Eric who is a newer friend. Eli also introduced Eric to Fred Mayer, the subject of his latest book, Return to the Reich. And before we launch into the pursuit of Nazis, let's start with Return of the Reich. Gentlemen?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Rabbi and Esther and Stefanie and Heather for that beautiful musical introduction, especially, and for bringing us together on such an important day. I wish we could be doing it in person, but this is a pretty good backup. Yeah, I'd love to start with Freddie Mayer, who is a hero of mine and the subject of my latest book. I'll show you the cover there, Return to the Reich, the Holocaust Refugees' Secret Mission to Defeat the Nazis. And I love telling the story of how I first came to hear of Freddie Mayer, because I had, someone embarrassed to say, I'd never heard of him until about 4 years ago. And I was having coffee with Eli in a Washington coffee shop. My last book, The Nazis Next Door, had just come out, and that was a grim look at the thousands of Nazi war criminals and accomplices who had gotten into the United States after the war. And Eli had been prominently featured in the last third of that book as one of the most dogged Nazi investigators you will ever see, Al Pacino included. He does not like to be called, Eli does not like to be called a Nazi hunter, but I think he'll put up with it in some circumstances. But I remember I was meeting with Eli, and I had just read an obituary on my way into work that morning at the New York Times about a Holocaust hero who had just passed away in Europe, a sort of Schindler's List type character who had saved hundreds and hundreds of Jews from certain extermination, one of the righteous Gentiles, as we would call them now. But I had never heard of this person. And I remember saying to Eli that with some embarrassment that by the day, these incredibly brave people, both Jews and Gentiles and other groups, were dying in their 80s and then in early 90s, and without their stories being fully told. We've certainly been telling them more since about the late 1970s than we had before that, but still so much to learn from this brave group of survivors and others. And I remember saying to Eli, tell me someone that I wish I could meet who's still alive today, whose obituary I'm not going to read tomorrow and say, darn, I wish I had had the chance to meet someone like that before they passed away. And he said, I know just who you should meet, Freddie Mayer. And with Esther's help, she's being a little modest. It was both Freddie and Eli and Esther who put me in touch with Freddie. I went to see him in his home in West Virginia. This remarkable man who was then about 93 years old, and he had been a Holocaust survivor who escaped Nazi Germany as a teenager with his family, got out really just in the nick of time when visas were very, very difficult, if not impossible to get. There was just a brief window, a few months or so in late 1938 when immigration policies eased up. FDR was able to let in 10, 15,000 or so, and he was among those. And he then had the temerity to want to go back. And in fact, he tried and failed at first to go back because after Pearl Harbor, he went down to his local recruitment board and was turned away because he was considered, as he liked to joke about later, an enemy alien. As a German Jew. And he said, but I was one of the Jews. I was one of the ones they were trying to kill. And it didn't matter to the US Army. He was still considered the enemy alien. They later came to their senses, and he was able to join the army and was able to join an elite spy force that was started up, really a fly by the seat of its pants operation called OSS under a World War I war hero named General William Donovan. And the exploits that Freddie was able to pull off in returning to Europe. He parachuted into Austria on 13,000 feet onto a glacier with just 2 other men, one of them actually a Nazi defector who had agreed to help the United States, and the second man also a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands, a man by the name of Hans Winberg. And I have a picture that I'll show you, if you can see it on the screen here, of the 3 of them after their victory in Austria. That's Freddie here on the left, and Hans, the tall, lanky one here, and the third gentleman, the Nazi defector, was a man named Franz Weber. And it was really all Freddie. It was a 3-man operation, but Freddie posed for 2 months undercover as most of that time as a Nazi. When I went to see him, when I went to see Freddie at his home in West Virginia, I made the mistake of asking him. I said, "How could it be that a little Jewish guy who's about 5'6", but all muscle, a little Jewish guy could be undercover as a Nazi for 2 months in and around Innsbruck, the capital of the Nazi stronghold, one of their last strongholds in Austria, and not be discovered?" And he laughed and he corrected me very gently. He said, "Well, I'll try and do my Freddie accent." He said, "Well, I was only a Nazi for about 6 weeks. And then I became a French electrician." And he did the accent that he used to become a Frenchman. He said, instead of, his name was Friedrich Mayer, that was his birth name growing up in Germany, although he was usually known as Fritz in Germany. He gave that up because it sounded too German once he came to the United States. But he said to become a pose as an undercover Frenchman, he didn't even have to change his name. He said, "I became Frédéric Mayer." And he just laughed, this garrulous laugh. He was just so proud of himself. And he actually, for 2 weeks after he was done being a Nazi, he was at an underground slave labor camp outside Innsbruck, a Messerschmitt airplane, not just any airplane plant. It was what was designed to be one of the fastest jet airplanes on Earth at that time. And his job was to find out where production was for the Nazis at that point. And he succeeded in doing that. He succeeded in finding out details about Hitler's bunker and the fortifications in Berlin. And he succeeded in finding out about the train lines that the Nazis were using to get supplies down to the Italian front. More twists and turns than I can properly do justice to in a few short minutes. He was even captured and tortured by the Nazis prior to the end of the war. And Freddie was quite a fast talker, as Esther can tell you, and he actually managed to not only talk his way out of custody, but talk the Germans into cutting a deal to surrender in Austria, and saving countless lives in what was expected to be a blood battle in Austria. This sort of last fortress, the last Nazi Alpine fortress of the war. Was recognized as one of the great heroes of OSS, and it was an honor for me to meet him, and I have Esther and Eli to thank for doing that.
It's an amazing story, and I have to say, hearing about Freddie Mayer's story probably makes most of us on this call feel relatively inadequate about any of the achievements we've managed in our life thus far.
He was incredibly humble about it. He didn't really seek accolades for most of his life. In fact, Esther in his last few years was trying to get, among others, was trying to get a Medal of Honor for him because he was never awarded it. And Esther could speak to that also. But with the support of Senator Jay Rockefeller in West Virginia, and he didn't get it by the time he passed away. He passed away, unfortunately, just 6 weeks after I met him, and so I unfortunately got to write about him much more quickly than I expected. I wrote an obituary in the New York Times in the spring of 2016, almost exactly 4 years ago. And he hasn't gotten it posthumously. There's still the chance, but he never really sought it out. You know, he was certainly proud of what he had done, but you know, he would always say that he felt it was almost his duty, his solemn duty as a German Jew, as a Holocaust survivor, to go back in and do what he could do to end, you know, this horrible war.
It's an absolutely amazing story. But here's the thing that's really interesting. I know you can help me answer this. You know, Freddie goes back into the Third Reich undercover. Meanwhile, right, during the war, Jews are trying to get into the United States. And not only that, as the war's coming to an end, there's a scramble by the Nazis to get into the United States. And these two strange movements almost parallel. Just tell us about what was going on with those two groups.
Yeah, it's really tragic and still not understood by a lot of people in America or elsewhere. I think that you had this exodus after the war of you had several million displaced people, even greater than what we've seen in the last few years in Syria. I think the numbers are upwards of 4 or 5 million displaced persons. And the US, for the better part of 4 or 5 years, was keeping out the Jews because
For what reason?
Well, a lot of it was, and Eli could speak to this too, a lot of it was anti-Semitism. There were congressional quotas in place, and there was a feeling that by certain senators and congressmen that those of Jewish stock were not the people who were wanted in the United States. And that did not change really in any great numbers until about 5 years after the war, with new immigration policies put in place beginning in 1950. So the Jews were, hundreds of thousands were in these displaced persons camps for many, many months under horrendous circumstances. There was even a report to Truman by an emissary of his who was the dean of the Penn Law School, a guy by the name of Earl Harrison, who went to visit these displaced person camps after the war, being run by General Patton, who turned out to be a horrible anti-Semite. And Harrison was just shocked by the conditions that they were. You had thousands and thousands of Jews who were being bunked side by side with Nazi captors, who were not given sufficient medical attention, who were not being given, food rations to compensate for the basically years-long fasts that they've been enduring under the Nazis, and conditions gradually improved, but the gates to the United States did not open in any large numbers for 3, 4, 5 years. And there were people in those camps for as long as 5 or 6 years. And meanwhile, because of the Cold War, you had upwards of 400,000 people who were coming to the United States from Eastern Europe, because we saw those as the people that we wanted to grab before the Soviet bloc would sort of draw them in and surround them. And those were the people that congressional immigration measures would accept in large numbers for those first few years. Many of them, of course, were war refugees who in every sense of the word, but there were also many of them, thousands in the estimate of people who research this, who were high-level Nazis and Nazi collaborators. There were all around the United States. There was a top aide to Adolf Eichmann. There was a man who ran a concentration camp in Estonia who lived in Long Island. Eli is the expert on this, so I'll defer to him. But the immigration policies made it possible, unfortunately, for many, many Nazis and Nazi collaborators to get in, and made it very difficult for the Jews to get in for a number of years.
Yes, and Eli, can we just get your input on this in terms of those respective movements?
I'm sorry,
in terms of the respective, particularly of the Nazis, and how some of the Nazis and Nazi collaborators were able to get into the United States.
Yes, most of them got in the old-fashioned way by lying about their pasts. A number of them, unfortunately, didn't do that, and their pasts were known, at least in significant part, to U.S. authorities, but they were deemed to be of value to the United States in fighting the Cold War against our former ally, the Soviet Union. And so those pasts were overlooked and they were allowed into the United States. Eric has told that story in a wonderful book that he wrote and mentioned a few years ago when Esther mentioned it. I think it's really appropriate that on this solemn day that we have begun with tales of two really ultra-heroic survivors and escapees of the Shoah, Vitka Kovner and also Fred Mayer. Fred's story is almost beyond belief. It's recounted, of course, at great length in Eric's book. Eric is acclaimed in particular for many, many years as one of the leading authorities on U.S. intelligence. He's written extensively in various places about U.S. intelligence. So I don't want to destroy that career, but Eric, you may want to consider Hollywood screenwriting, because when you read the story of Fred Mayer as Eric Lichtblau tells it, it seems like a Hollywood movie. And in fact, there was a superb documentary that I know about only because of Esther Finder, who interviewed Fred Mayer on videotape years ago and was his strongest champion in the effort to get him the Congressional Medal of Honor, which Fred expressed absolutely no interest in, as Eric said. But it was, you know, how fate makes certain things happen. I was in your beautiful city of Las Vegas, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, for a gathering of second generation that I was invited to speak at by Esther, and a film on the documentary on Fred Mayer was shown, and Esther had to kind of pull me into the room to watch it, and I'm so glad that she did, because it was an unforgettable introduction to the story, which is told much more fully in Eric's book.
No, it sounds like it's something we should definitely watch. And I just want to go back for a second. I know it was a little bit of a throwaway comment from Eric before about Al Pacino and Nazi hunters. You know, for everyone watching right now, you're looking at two real-life Nazi hunters. So forget the glitz and glamour of an Amazon Prime series. We want to know the reality. So, you know, just go back to Eric for a second. How do you track someone, a vicious criminal who's been part of the Nazi regime, who's living safely in America? What are your methods? Do you do it yourself? Do you hire, you know, I have my image in my head of these hard-bitten PIs in trench coats. Okay, so what's the reality? Take us through it. Paint us a picture.
Well, I think the first thing to know about the history is that for many years after the war, hardly anyone in America was looking for these guys, quite sadly. From 1945, the end of the war, when they first started coming in within months, some of them scientists like Werner von Braun, and others immigrants who just snuck in, as Eli said, by lying about their past. But from 1945 until the late 1970s, there was no effort to find these guys. There were no Nazi hunters, by and large, because of indifference, I think because of anti-Semitism, because of bureaucratic ineptitude. In my my book 4 or 5 years ago, The Nazis Next Door, I discovered another hero. I'll put it, Freddie Mayer is in the hero category. Another guy who I'd never heard of before researching that book was a guy in the 1960s, a journalist named Chuck Allen, who spent years and years writing mostly for left-wing publications like The Nation, or sometimes even for communist publications, and trying to out these Nazis and naming names in 40-page reports that he would put out. And not only did no one listen to him, but he had the good thanks of J. Edgar Hoover putting a wiretap and a tail on him because he was seen as a communist plant, because no one wanted to think think, or at least acknowledge, that there were Nazis in America. And it wasn't until the late 1970s, really under political pressure from several people in Congress, mostly Elizabeth Holtzman, that Congress forced the Justice Department to create the office that Eli led for so long, OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, and that people like Eli and his predecessors there, Neil Schur was another one, and a long list of very dogged investigators began looking at and Eli Cannon should tell the story himself, but just from the outside perspective that I have, it was a difficult task that they took up, because at that point, the war was 35 years old, at least, and going to the 1980s. Witnesses were, you had fading memories, you had fading documents, and it was not really until the mid to late 1980s that a lot of the documentary evidence came along, ironically as a result of the fall of the Soviet Empire, because you had many thousands of pages of documents that had been trapped behind the Soviet Empire, the Soviet wall, if you will, with IDs of actual Nazi officials, from guards on up to top officials, that the Soviets were in time willing to turn over to US investigators. In fact, this would be my segue to Eli. Just a few months ago, Eli amazingly sent away, we joked a few years ago that he will never send away another Nazi. He sent away another Nazi just a few months ago through the benefit of documents that were at the bottom of the sea, with a Nazi ID card of a guy from Tennessee. Was it Tennessee?
Exactly. Tennessee.
So that'll be my segue. I mean, maybe Eli saved his best for last with that one.
Well, I don't know about that, but the case that Eric mentions, Friedrich Berger, he was a guard in the Neuengamme concentration camp system, and we indeed found him in Tennessee. He's not deported yet, but about a month and a half ago, after a 2-day trial in Memphis, the judge issued a deportation order. There were many unusual aspects of that case. The one that was most moving for me is that over the now over 40 years that we've been bringing these cases, it hardly has ever happened that we brought a case without the benefit of survivors, Holocaust survivors, coming to court and bravely reopening these psychological wounds that can never heal, in order to explain to American judges the reality or give them at least a sense of the reality of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes from the standpoint of people who actually experienced them as targets. In this instance, we had no survivor witnesses because at this very late date, we're about to reach the 75th anniversary of VE Day next month. There were no survivors left from the subcamp at which Mr. Berger served, who were available, physically available to testify anymore. But we proved our case. As Eric said, one of the key pieces of evidence, and without it, I can't imagine we would have been able to go forward, was an identification card, not literally an ID card that you would carry, but personnel card that was on a ship, the Thielbeck, a German ship that, along with a larger ship, the Cap Arcona, was packed with Holocaust survivors from the Neuengamme system, including from the subcamp at which Berger served. and accidentally bombed by the British Royal Air Force in the last week of World War II in May 1945. Of course, they didn't know that there were Nazi victims on these ships. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Thousands and thousands of innocent people died, also some guards. It's somehow fitting that the last great tragedy of the Holocaust, perhaps, helped yield what may be the last prosecution to come out of the Nazi period. The card itself went down with the ship, and 5 years later, the ship was salvaged by the harbor police in Lubeck, Germany, and lo and behold, that card could still be read with his name and certain information on it.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, Eli, here's a question for you. If you're in the middle of these investigations and you're a son of the Jewish people, but at the same time you're a son of the Justice Department and you're trying to do a professional job. So what happens in an investigation when you're face to face with someone the evidence seems to suggest is indeed a Nazi or a Nazi collaborator? So how do you keep impartiality? What's going through your mind at that moment, the experience of interrogating that person?
Well, I think at some level this is an experience that is common in law enforcement, right? If you're a human being, your heart goes out to victims, and especially when you're investigating crimes of violence, which alas continue to occur everywhere. It's easy to imagine oneself or one's family as being among the victims. But I must say, it's imperative to keep one's cool and apply the law as it's intended, fairly. I've had the experience many times over the years of questioning suspects, some of whom we've been able to prosecute later, sometimes because they've admitted things they ought not have admitted during those interviews that my colleagues and I do. And I've had some remarkable admissions made to me over the years, including by one man, Jacob Reimer, whom I questioned at the U.S. Attorney's Office many years ago in Manhattan, and very reluctantly admitted leading his platoon of men on a mission to, as he put it, liquidate a Jewish labor camp. And then he described how they shot all these victims who had been gathered in a pit in the woods. It hits you later that night or some later night when you really think about it. But when you're actually questioning someone, you have to be focused in laser-like fashion just to find out the truth as best you can.
I understand. I appreciate you giving us that insight. Eric, I don't know if you can answer this question. Have you ever had a situation where, and maybe this is, if not Eric, then Eli, a situation where you got to the bottom of the story, you found a Nazi or a Nazi collaborator hiding in the United States, and you've either broken the news yourself or seen this, been witness to, the family of that person start to realize who in fact or their loved one is, or what in fact they did. Can you tell us about any of that kind of experience?
Sure. I did talk for the Nazis Next Door. I spoke to many children of accused Nazis, and a few of the Nazis themselves. Another fellow up in Queens who I interviewed, Polly, who Eli deported successfully a few years after I interviewed him. And with only one exception, the children of these accused Nazis believed unfailingly in their parents' innocence. And maybe that just says something about the child parent bond that in most cases that's so unyielding. But except for this one exception, the children all believed that their fathers were either the victims of communist propaganda for being anti-Soviet, they were being punished for this, or mistaken identity, or overzealous prosecutors. There was one thing or another, despite overwhelming evidence in virtually all these cases. The one exception, who I spent a lot of time talking to this person for my book and devote a whole chapter to it, was a guy, the son of a guy named Otto von Bolschwing, who was, it turned out, a top aide to Adolf Eichmann. And his son was a lawyer who the Justice Department first approached when they opened this case in the early 1980s. And like all of these people, he believed at first this was some horrible mistake, that he had never heard his father utter an anti-Semitic word the whole time they had been living in the United States. He lived first in Massachusetts, then New York, and then his father moved to California. Never saw any sign of this. His father had even, after the war, married a Jewish woman, a half-Jewish woman, or part Jewish woman, I believe it was. But then as a lawyer, when he started digging through this, he came to realize that his father had led this double life and in fact was involved in some of the early drafts of what became Eichmann's final solution and in producing anti-Semitic literature and a whole host of just horrible things that were almost too hard for him to imagine. But, you know, as I said, he was unfortunately the exception.
And what was his reaction? I mean, what did he do? You know, what did he say?
He could never understand it. He did not. He couldn't put it into context. His father at that point was quite ill, and his father never gave him any sort of satisfying explanation. And really, what explanation is there for, you know, here I helped build the Jewish office within the Third Reich under Adolf Eichmann. What is there to say? So he sort of compartmentalized it, put it away in a place like his father had done horrible things, and he lived with that. He lived with the sins of the father. Understood.
Eli, do you have any insight into that? Relatives of those folks?
I would agree with what Eric said. I mean, it's mostly denial. And again, I think that's common across a wide spectrum in law enforcement, especially the parent-child aspect of it. I always say that the families of violent criminals are among their victims. You know, they see the parent exposed and sent away, and you know, they are among the victims.
No, understood. And so just give us some help here. Just put things into context with the Department of Justice, and the U.S. government. How many Nazis or Nazi collaborators have you prosecuted? You know, we're not going to give you a scorecard here, but you know, we want to get a sense of it.
Well, rabbis, our office, former office, now the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section in the Justice Department Criminal Division, was set up belatedly in 1979 for exactly the reason that Eric mentioned. It was primarily media attention given by his former newspaper, the New York Times, especially a great reporter there, Ralph Blumenthal, and ABC Television and others that prompted Congress to look into this and pressure the Justice Department to finally take these cases seriously. When we were created in 1979, the U.S. government's total number of victories in Nazi cases since the war, in the decade since the war, was 2. 1 deportation and 1 extradition of particularly brutal Nazi guard by the name of Hermina Braunsteiner-Ryan, who lived in Queens, New York, to Germany, where she was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment. since 1979, since our office was created, former office, we've won cases against well over 100 Nazi participants in Nazi crimes of persecution. And over the past 30 years, when most of those victories actually were recorded, we have won more cases than have all the other countries of the world combined. And I think that is at once a tribute to my extraordinarily talented and devoted colleagues and to the support that we've received from attorneys general and assistant attorneys general up to the present time, Brian Benchkowski, our current AAG. But it's also, let's face it, a sad commentary on European governments' lack of interest in pursuing justice on behalf of the victims of the Shoah. After all, the vast majority of Nazi perpetrators, participants in Nazi crimes, didn't come to the United States, didn't come to North America, Central America, or South America. They stayed where they always were, in Germany and Austria. So really, those countries should have been leading the way all these years.
Yeah, it certainly looks like.
I think it's also worth mentioning, if I may, Rabbi, that both before and after Eli's office was created in 1979, there were very difficult legal issues that the United States faced in trying to take action against these guys. And within a few years after the war, and I believe the early 1950s, there was a case brought by the Justice Department in maybe 1951 against a very high-ranking guy whose name is escaping me, from Croatia. He had been basically a cabinet minister who signed the imprisonment orders and effectively death warrants for hundreds of thousands of Nazi opponents. Eli, I'm blanking on his name.
Andrea Artukovic.
Artukovic, that's right, yes. And the courts threw that out. And that was seen, and I got into this in my book, that was seen as really a disincentive because there were no statutes on the books, and to this day they're not, for punishing someone who came to America and was a World War II war criminal. And so Eli's office has had to rely on evidence that they lied about their Nazi past to get into America. And it's a bit, I think Eli would agree, a bit like, threading a needle to find the legal predicate to get them out of the country, either through deportation or denaturalization. And even then, as most people don't realize, getting a judge to order them deported is only half the battle, because you have to find a country that will take them. And as Eli alluded to, Germany wouldn't take their Nazi Nazi persecutors for many, many years. I remember there was a German minister who said to one of Eli's predecessors, "Why would we take our Nazis back? They're your problem."
I think her exact words were, "Why should we take your garbage?"
Yeah.
As though this were something we had created.
So we're a nation of laws, of due process, and that they were swimming against the tide on a lot of legal and diplomatic difficulties to try and get even a few hundred out of the country in the course of 30 years, a few hundred out of what certainly was thousands of Nazis and Nazi collaborators just in the United States.
Yes, and we got moving towards the end of our time. I just want to check in with the last piece, which links into all of this. Eli, you've had pushback about prosecuting people whose crimes took place decades before, and if so, what's been your answer?
Well, over the years, there was in the past, especially, quite a lot of organized opposition to our work in the United States. Not just the usual people you would expect, neo-Nazis and the like, but other people. Patrick Buchanan, for instance, was a diehard opponent of our work, we spent a tremendous amount of time just defending our program, and it was a huge diversion, frankly, of resources from our work in chief, which was, of course, to investigate and prosecute these cases and secure some measure of justice, however inadequate, on behalf of survivors of the Holocaust, so many of whom made their homes here, including in Las Vegas, and should never have had to share their adopted homeland with their former tormentors.
I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today. The aforementioned Kovner and Mayer, whereas their exploits might have been slightly more dramatic than your own, I'm not sure anyone would argue with me when I say the work that you do has been and will continue to be absolutely vital for justice for the Jewish people, and the legacy that you will look back on. You should be so proud of it. My friends, I want to turn to the last part of our program, and we're actually going to take a more reflective moment for three last pieces. I'll recite the El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer, in a moment, following which Heather will recite a special Kaddish and a final song. And so we'll take a moment now for that memorial prayer. El Malei Rachamim, Shochen B'Avrami, Hametzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei HaShechina, B'Mahalot Kedoshim U'Tahorim, Kezohar HaMaziri, Et Nishmot Shisha Milion Achenu V'Achiotenu Shenehergu Al Kiddush Hashem Ba'al Alachamim Yastirem B'Seter Kenafa Le'olamim Vayitzro B'Tzor Chaim Et Nishmatam Adonai hu nachalatam ve'anuchu b'shalom amishkavam v'nomar Amen.
We now chant the Mourner's Kaddish to remember the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, but we should also remember other people around the world who have been persecuted simply for who they are. Please rise where you are if you are able. Yitzgadal, Auschwitz, Ve'yitzkadash, Dachau, Shemer Abba, Warsaw, Ve'amad Divra Chirute, Bogdanovka, Ve'yamlich Malchute, Ravensbrück, Ve'chayechon Novyomechon, Vilna, Uvchaye Dekol Beit Yisrael, Treblinka, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv, Chalno, Ve'imru Amen. Yehi Shmer Rabba Mevarach, Le'olam U'Lamei Almaya, Yitbarach Ve'yishtabach, Belzak, Ve'yitpa'ar Ve'yitromam, Buchenwald, Ve'yitnaseh Ve'yithadar, Sobibor, Ve'yitaleh Ve'yithalal, Maidanak, Shmei Dekudsha Brechu, Mauthausen, Le'ela, Wuj, Mikol Berchata Ve'shirata, Gurs, Tush Bechata Ve'nechemata, Babiyar, Da'amiran Be'ama, Bergen-Belsen, Ve'imru Amen. Yehi Shlam Rabba Min Shemaya, Ve'chayim Aleinu Ve'al Yisrael, Ve'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Huya Oseh Shalom, Aleinu Ve'al Yisrael, Ve'imru Amen. You may be seated. I'll just continue to go into A piece. Michael was a survivor I met 7 years ago. He told the immigrant community his story of separation from his mother who perished in concentration camps. All he remembered through the years was a song she sang to him, which he held so tightly. This song was sung for him for the first time in decades, and now this story and this song will continue and not be forgotten. A Zisa melody, a sweet song. Please sing along at home to keep this melody with you and to keep it alive, and Michal's story. A long time ago, I remember Mama singing a Zisa melody. When I close my eyes and worry for tomorrow, a Zisa melody. When the day was long and I can't sleep, a Zisa melody. And when Daddy's gone and it's only us, a Zisa melody. Yai dai dai dai, yai dai 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 dai, a Zisa melody. Schlaf mein Kind, hör auf zu sehnen, deine Augen lach verschliss. So sleep, my child, hear this and close your eyes. It's time to go to sleep. And when you close them, dream of the sweet things. Herr dein Lied, hear this song. Die Welt ist süß. Yavarechecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha, Zisa melody. Yi'er Adonai panav elecha v'ychunecha, Zisa melody. Yisa Adonai panav elecha, Zisa melody. Ve'yasem lecha shalom, Zisa melody. So when you close them, dream of the sweet things. Herr dein Lied, hear this song. Die Welt ist süß.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you in particular to Eric and Eli for spending your time with us. I know it's much later over there. Please, everybody, have Shavua Tov, a good week, a safe and healthy week. God bless. Go in peace.